By principle, the U.S. electorate is composed of all American citizens eligible to vote, a fundamental democratic right enshrined in the Constitution. The electorate should represent the entirety of the adult population, regardless of race, class, gender, or political affiliation. However, in practice, the picture of the American electorate is far more complicated. Certain groups face systemic exclusion, whether through deliberate voter suppression tactics, structural barriers, or more insidious forms of marginalization, such as not being conceived of or targeted as voters. In this episode of Who is Voting in 2024, we'll explore these dynamics, asking who is truly the U.S. electorate? With the world watching the 2024 U.S. campaign unfolding, what mechanisms determine who gets to participate fully in the electoral process? Most importantly, what can be done to address these systemic exclusions and foster a more inclusive democracy? To help us unpack these critical questions, we're joined by two distinguished guests, Shilpa Jindia, fellow at the Campaign Legal Center, also known as CLC, and Benjamin Goldfrank, professor of political science at Seton Hall University. Together, we'll discuss the pathways to greater inclusion, considering both legal and civic approaches needed to create an electorate that genuinely represents all Americans and putting the U.S. elections in a global perspective. Let's start with a more historical, long-term perspective. Shilpa, could you explain some of the key mechanisms that have historically either expanded or restricted voter participation in U.S. elections, and who are the groups most affected by these barriers?
Historically, in the United States, the main barriers were widespread disenfranchisement itself by restricting the right to vote, initially only to white property-owning males. The franchise was gradually expanded after the Civil War to include everyone else through the 15th and 19th Amendments of the Constitution, respectively, which prohibit denying the right to vote on the basis of race and gender. Yet, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, states continued to pass a range of measures to suppress the vote, notably poll taxes and literary tests that were later found to be unconstitutional, and these were aimed at suppressing the Black vote. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to reinforce the constitutional prohibition on racial discrimination, and this was the sort of technical endpoint of the Jim Crow era. Yet, as America's population grows more diverse, we continue to see all sorts of measures enacted to suppress voting. Still have bans on people with felony convictions from voting. And of course, this population are disproportionately people of color, and this is itself a legacy of this racial history. And then there are other suppression tactics that we've been seeing more recently that have largely turned the administration of elections themselves into a battleground. So I think the most dramatic example of this was former President Trump's attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election and the January 6th attack, which tried to stop the certification of results. And this kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of how elections are administered in the U.S., which is not just through the popular vote, but then the certification of those votes through the Electoral College. But states have been working continually for years to try to impede voting by turning this seemingly anodyne process of election administration into a fight. So they've done so by making voter registration and voting itself more difficult through unnecessary and onerous requirements or other barriers. So states have passed laws that will reject mail-in ballots because of the tiniest discrepancies in signatures. If somebody forgets to put their middle initial to match what's on file with their driver's license. Georgia passed another law that would ban election volunteers from passing out water bottles and food to people waiting in line. Arizona tried to pass a law that would require documentary proof of citizenship and proof of residency. So these are all attempts to make voting more difficult and to deter participation. And these measures disproportionately affect people of color. For example, documentary proof of citizenship chills the participation of naturalized Americans, while residency requirements burden tribal voters on reservations who have non-standard addresses. So you've seen a range of tactics across different states, and it's concerning to see this continued effort 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Benjamin, how do these mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion in the U.S. compare to what has been seen globally in other democracies, Have similar trends been evident elsewhere, for example, in Latin America, which is the region that you study?
So what's interesting about the United States is that we are the only country in the world that has this electoral college for the presidency, the only democracy that has an electoral college, which really dilutes the one person, one vote rule. Right? And so when other countries democratized, and especially after they gave women the right to vote, which took a long time in some countries, including Switzerland, where you're based right now. But once most countries democratized, they made it fairly easy to register and to vote. And most countries have a national identity card. The United States doesn't really have a national identity card. So whereas everywhere else, registering and voting is a pretty normal, easy thing to do, in the United States, it's very complicated and it changes in each state. Each state has its own rules about this. And while you do see lots of efforts to restrict voting, and especially after the Supreme Court overruled the Voting Rights Act or basically gutted it by making states able to change their voting laws without pre-approval by the courts. So there have been a huge amount of new restrictive laws on voting. But at the same time, in other states, they've tried to make voting easier by expanding mail-in ballots, by having early voting. Because the other weird thing about the United States is that we vote on a Tuesday, right? Almost everywhere else, you vote on Sunday. And so we have these weird contrasting trends in different states of trying to expand voting access and trying to restrict it. And that lines up pretty well with political parties in the United States as well. As the Democratic Party, the states that they control tend to make it easier to register and easier to vote. Whereas in Republican-held states, they make it harder to register and harder to vote. Once most of the region or all of the region democratized by the late 1980s, it was pretty easy to vote. And in many countries, it's mandatory. In 12 countries in Latin America, voting is mandatory. And one interesting thing is like Brazil, they made it everyone over 18 has to vote. But once you hit 65 or 70, it becomes optional. And they also make it optional for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. So they expanded voting access in that way. Just to highlight the uniqueness of the United States, the other thing is that nearly 1 million residents of our capital city do not have representation in Congress, either in the House or the Senate. And U.S.-controlled territories like Puerto Rico and Guam don't have representation and don't have a vote in the presidential election. So we've got 3.5 million citizens or residents connected to the United States who don't have a vote in Congress. Most democracies don't make citizens register and do allow formerly incarcerated people to vote. And of course, we also have this distinctively high levels of gerrymandering and malapportion through the Senate. And that also further dilutes voter power and disincentivizes voting, as the Congress doesn't really reflect the majority's wishes on many key issues, from abortion to gun laws to Social Security, many issues.
Thank you. Now, there may be ways in which these long-standing issues and trends are changing in the 2024 election. Shilpa, could you tell us, through your work at the Campaign Legal Center, what do you see is new about the way this has played out in this campaign or this election?
I think they really go back to the fact that voting was never intended to include everyone. And even though we've made a lot of progress in trying to expand the franchise, there is still always that fundamental tension about who gets to vote. And going into 2024, into this election, we're seeing that fight continue to play out. So, as Benjamin alluded to, states administer and run their own elections. They pass all their own election laws, and elections are administered at the local county level. And this system of voter registration, of voter maintenance, of election administration for eligible voters in America is very secure and reliable. And yet you've seen a lot of distrust being sowed into this system. And there are a lot of concerns going into November about political violence, about potential attempts to, again, deny election certification at the state level rather than in Congress, as we saw in 2021. And one really pernicious avenue for this during this election season has been the narrative of so-called non-citizen voting. And as the election season has ramped up, we've seen widespread effort by bad actors, both online and offline, to talk about how non-citizens supposedly are voting in our elections, even though only eligible Americans vote, and the incidence of non-citizen voting is incredibly rare. Yet we're seeing on social and conservative media and from Republican politicians, in addition to the Trump campaign, all this kind of discussion. And it's really about setting up an excuse and a reason for him to contest the election. And he's doing so ahead of time now. It continues Trump's 2020 strategy of calling the results of the election into question, this time by casting doubt ahead of time over who will be voting in the election. And we've seen individual states playing into this as well by enacting voter purges of these so-called non-citizens from the voter rolls. And in reality, these programs target naturalized citizens who have just as much right to vote as US-born citizens and who have also worked incredibly hard to earn their right to vote. And these tactics, by extension, are meant to intimidate immigrant communities. We've seen these voter purge programs in different states like Alabama, Texas, and Virginia, and CLC has filed lawsuits in Alabama and Virginia to go after these voter purge programs because they violate federal and constitutional law in different ways. And we actually had a big win in Alabama yesterday where a federal judge temporarily halted one of these voter purge programs until the election because it violates a federal law that prohibits systematic voter removals within 90 days of a federal election. But even once this election is over, we're sure to see these attacks on election laws through the framework of non-citizen voting continue to play out. And this extends from America's racial history of voter suppression. Since the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which was passed the same year as the Voting Rights Act, this was really a watershed year in the civil rights movement, America's immigrant population has become much more diverse as more of these immigrant communities have come from outside Western Europe. So they become much more brown and black. And America is set to become a majority-minority country by 2050. And that's the fundamental threat that is presented by more immigrants who are naturalizing and voting in our elections. It's a threat for Americans who still identify their own power through racial superiority. And that's why you see online disinformation around this issue focusing on what's called Great Replacement Theory, which is a supremacist idea that, quote unquote, white America is being destroyed. Though there are also immigrant communities who believe this narrative as well, at least about ineligible citizens voting. Yet these factions are simply fighting the inevitable. America has always been a multiracial country, even if everybody didn't have the right to vote. And that's why CLC, along with other pro-democracy or pro-voting rights groups, are fighting to make sure that our democracy actually represents that. And that's where that fundamental fight continues.
And Benjamin, in terms of political campaigns in times of polarization, are political parties changing or innovating how they pander to their electorates? Also, Bolsonaro and Brazil and Trump have frequently been compared. Do you find similarities or differences in how they appeal to their electorates and how the electorate answers to them?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And just to jump off of what Shilpa was talking about, the Great Replacement Theory, because that Great Replacement Theory started in Europe. And now, as it's been filtered into the United States, one aspect of this idea, I think from Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, was that George Soros and the Jews are helping the Democratic Party bring immigrants in to vote Democrat. So this is it's a partisan idea, this Great Replacement Theory. And of course, non-citizens, they don't want to risk their legal situation by voting in an election, right? So the fact that they're spreading this rumor that non-citizens are voting in huge numbers, Trump talked about millions of illegals voting, is absolutely ludicrous. But in terms of what's happening in these polarized times, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, or at least their candidates, are trying to win voters traditionally seen as in the other side's camp. right now, what you're seeing is Kamala Harris is pandering to disaffected Republican voters who would prefer a normal candidate, not someone who's trying to overturn elections or cozy up to Putin or buy Greenland or whatever bizarre thing Trump and Vance have been saying recently, right? They want someone who's more of a typical mainstream Republican. And so Kamala Harris is tacking towards the center or the right really hard right now and abandoning some of the Democratic base. So she's not leaning into the polarization. She's really trying to pull back to the center, I would say. Donald Trump, oddly enough, is trying to woo Black and Latino voters by saying that illegal immigrants are stealing their jobs, right? Trump was on Univision on the Latino town hall just yesterday and tried to tell Latino farm workers that immigrants are stealing their jobs. It was just bizarre. At the same time, Trump and the Republicans, unlike Harris, are really sticking to these polarizing talking points as well, which is similar to Bolsonaro in Brazil and his demonization of the opposition, calling them lunatic left and saying that he's going to send the military after them, right, with these really violent insults and racism and homophobia. And in the U.S. case, transphobia, right? The Republican Party is really leaning into transphobia, airing these campaign ads saying that Kamala is for they, them, and so she's not for you. Unfortunately, I would say, this kind of rhetoric from Trump is actually peeling off some Latino and Black voters, particularly male voters, who typically voted Democrat before. And so there is it's not a huge move, but there's definitely some percentage of Black and Latino voters who are tending towards voting for Trump more than in the past. And Harris's pandering to centrist Republicans may be working, but it may also be annoying more progressive Democrats who are not thrilled to see her welcoming Republicans to speak at the Democratic Convention while not allowing any Palestinian Americans to speak. And so the whole uncommitted movement did not get any official airtime whatsoever. And I think young people of white, Black, brown, whatever, there's a trend towards them being skeptical of the Harris candidacy, partly because of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. Because we, in this electoral college system where a few single states really matter, in this case, Michigan matters a lot. There are a lot of Arab American voters there who may just not vote at all, and they feel disenfranchised by the system right now.
So there are other ways in which a part of the electorate can become excluded through, for example, feelings of disenfranchisement or apathy. Shilpa, many voters, particularly young people and communities of color, feel disconnected from mainstream politics. Are there particular exclusionary practices that contribute to this disillusionment?
So nonpartisan pro-democracy groups like CLC or voting rights groups fight for the principle of one person, one vote. We're always trying to make sure that every single eligible individual can access the ballot, no matter who that vote is cast for. But there's this larger issue of meaningful access to the ballot, the feeling that your vote doesn't matter even if it's counted. And Benjamin mentioned the Electoral College, this issue of swing states, where the election increasingly comes down to a handful of states, and the rest of millions of Americans who are casting their vote, in essence, feel like it doesn't matter. So a lot of that is owed to the limitations of our two-party system, which I don't think have ever been as stark. And we can't forget that the U.S. is the third most populous country in the world behind India and China. And as Benjamin was talking about, the Democratic and Republican parties have become big tents for an incredibly diverse and polarized population that don't see their views reflected in either party. And an increasing number of Americans identify as independent voters and feel excluded from the party system and are not even reflected in these inter-party dynamics that I think tend to dominate the perception of American elections globally. I don't know if, from Benjamin's point of view, if independent voters also factor into this view of American elections, or if it's just about the sort of Democratic and Republican camps. And unlike other parliamentary systems that allow for more parties, the third party here in the US basically has been seen as a no-go since the 2000 election, when Ralph Nader was seen as having handed the election to President Bush, of course, with a very critical and decisive assist from the Supreme Court at the time.
So, of course, only US citizens can vote in the US election, but the election will actually have repercussions much beyond the US borders and affect many of us who are not able to vote. Benjamin, what do you see as the political consequences of the 2024 US election on Latin America, and how might the outcome of this election impact the region politically, economically?
I have to admit that in 2020, after the 2020 election, I was on a podcast with an old student in the Dominican Republic, and I said that I thought Biden was going to change course on immigration and end Trump's restrictive immigration policies. So I really botched this question in 2020. And I think instead what happened was that Biden and the Democrats have maintained and even worsened the restrictive policies, right, particularly on refugees and asylum, and probably in violation of international agreements and international law. But that said, I do think a Trump victory would lead to a spike in deportations, mostly back to Latin American countries, as he is promising to do right now. He's promising mass deportation. And in fact, you can buy a T-shirt that says mass deportation now. So there's been this huge shift towards demonizing immigrants. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party has really not stopped that. And has many ways gone along with it and not really stood up for immigrants as it should. I do think there would be a spike in deportations to Latin American countries particularly, and I don't think a Harris victory would produce that kind of repercussion. Generally, a Trump victory would strengthen the right globally and probably particularly in Latin America with people like Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, and of course, Bolsonarismo in Brazil, although probably his sons, Jair Bolsonaro's sons, because Jair himself is unable to run for office for another 6 years or so because of his attempts to overthrow the 2022 election in Brazil, whereas Trump has not faced any consequences for his attempt to overthrow the elections in 2020. In Brazil, they have investigated the people who have tried to overthrow the election, including Bolsonaro, and they've held people accountable. I think for the world, probably the most important consequence is that you would have a president of the United States who doesn't believe in global warming and would pull out of the Paris Treaty again. Countries that are interested in making a green transition or a Green New Deal would not have a partner in the United States, and global warming would accelerate even faster than it already is. I think that's probably the most consequential outcome. In terms of U.S. foreign policy, it hasn't really shifted too dramatically in other realms. So the establishment has maintained itself and imposed its policies without much change in between Democrats and Republicans over time.
Let's move on to a more hopeful note and what can be done about the issues and the patterns that we've discussed. Shilpa, what are some specific reforms or strategies that organizations like the Campaign Legal Center are advocating to re-engage voters or to make the electoral process more inclusive and equitable? You've already mentioned a few, but perhaps you'd like to add.
Yes, I think you'll see continued work trying to ease access to the ballot and to modernize voter registration so that it's easier, whether making sure that all states have online voter registration. Texas, for example, one of the biggest states in the US, doesn't have online voter registration, pushing for all states to adopt same-day registration, which is much more feasible these days with the technology that we have. And again, moving from this idea that voting has to be difficult to the idea that voter registration and going to the ballot box should be an easy and routine thing. But there are also critical reforms that are needed to remedy this issue of meaningful access to the ballot box. So you've seen some states start to experiment with passing ballot measures are passing laws to introduce this idea of ranked choice voting, which would allow for more competition and for more candidates within the political system. This would be in opposition to a winner-take-all system. And unless the Electoral College is abolished, which is a very unlikely occurrence, this is the only real meaningful structural reform that can be made in the interim to create more choice within our political system. And I'm curious what Benjamin thinks about compulsory voting and whether that would be a positive reform in the US or whether it would just wreak more havoc.
I don't know what I think about compulsory voting. I think I'm in favor of it because if you conceive of citizenship as conveying both rights but also duties, I think there's a duty to participate. And if you really don't like the candidates, you can always vote null or blank. And so I think I'm probably in favor of compulsory voting, but I haven't thought about it too much. And I don't think it'll ever happen in the United States. But I do want to pick up on what you were saying about abolishing the Electoral College. I also don't think that will happen, but there is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is this plan to have the states agree to give their Electoral College votes to the national popular vote winner. That could essentially get rid of the Electoral College without getting rid of it, right? Or sort of make it null and void. And that was one of the reforms that I think would be most important. And I also would support moving to more of a multi-party system, allowing fusion voting, ranked choice voting, getting away from the first past the post kind of system. And in terms of making citizenship more and civic participation more likely and promising in the United States, which sort of end on a positive note, one thing that is happening in many U.S. cities is experiments in local level participatory democracy, right? One thing is that I've studied a lot is participatory budgeting, which has been spreading first in Latin America and then in the United States and other parts of the world. But in the U.S., many cities are trying it out now. And what's interesting about it is that it allows formerly incarcerated people to vote. It allows young people to vote as young as 12 and 14. It allows non-citizens to vote in many cases. So it's a way of getting people involved in local politics and in elections and civic participation at a young age, and even when they're excluded from other kinds of activities, other kinds of typical representative elections. And participatory budgeting is happening in several schools as well across the country. So it's getting young people involved early. There are some studies that show that people who participate in participatory budgeting have started to vote at higher rates in typical elections as well. So there's some evidence to show that this is a potential pathway to greater citizen engagement.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Shilpa, do you have any final thoughts also on specific ongoing reforms of movements that you find particularly hopeful or promising?
I've had the privilege of representing civic organizations that volunteer their time to get out the vote, who I really didn't know about before I started this work. These are organizations that have a national presence or work solely locally, but they will set up tables at public events so people can register or update their registration. They'll go into nursing homes to assist senior voters. They help voters with disabilities. It again speaks to the incredible diversity within the electorate and the different types of needs that people have in making sure that they can vote. And these organizations themselves have come under increasing attack by states that have imposed burdensome regulations on them to the point of criminalization. It's another tactic of voter suppression. And yet they keep fighting. And it's made the harm of voter suppression really come alive for me, for what could be seen as an abstract issue of simply marking a piece of paper in the ballot box, because it's really about political participation, even in a system that initially denied the rights and humanity of someone like me as a woman of color. And I understand the anger and the apathy that people feel at the political system. I didn't vote in 2012 because I was so frustrated that Obama failed to close Guantanamo and to hold the Bush administration to account for the violations of international law under the war on terror. But I've also spent time living in and learning about autocratic countries, and I do believe that it can get worse here. And so for me, the only option is to fight for progress. And in the US, that struggle was built on the right to vote, to be included and to be heard. And these values still matter, even if they seem impossible. And in fact, they're under attack because they matter. And so we have a long way to go, and the law is certainly not the only answer, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to even fight in the courts. They're increasingly hostile and savvy and aware of exactly all the strategies and tactics that groups have enacted to try to protect the rights of everyone. But I feel incredibly privileged to get to know and to represent people on the front line of this fight.
Shilpa, Benjamin, thank you so much for finishing on a hopeful note and for stressing that public engagement and participation, even in an era that can be described as polarized, is alive and kicking in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us, and also thank you to our audience for listening to this episode of Who is Voting in 2024. And remember, you can find episodes on elections around the world wherever you get your podcast.